A great part of anti-communist, anti-socialist propaganda focuses on the issue of the so-called lack of freedom and democracy during the construction of the new society of socialism-communism. The main focus of that attack is the revolutionary workers' power, the state of the working class, the dictatorship of the proletariat, the role of the Communist Party. The capitalists cannot abide it. They tremble before the idea that the working class will emerge as the dominant class and that they will be thrown into the dustbin of history. When someone reads the word dictatorship, they imagine many things, as it is usually equated with harsh regimes, the authoritarian imposition of the will of a minority over a majority. However, if we examine the issue more carefully, we will realize that the term dictatorship expresses the power of one class over the other. When we refer to the dictatorship of the bourgeois class and respectively to the dictatorship of the proletariat, we talk about the class that has the power. In other words, the meaning of dictatorship is not synonymous with the form of governance of military imposition of the exploiting classes, the slave owners, the feudalists, now the capitalists, over the poor working class popular masses. Dictatorship is also the power of one class, even when it guarantees formal political equality between the members of different classes. Just as it occurs today in bourgeois parliamentary democracy, which is nothing else than the dictatorship of the bourgeois class, as we have everywhere the domination of the capital, which is concealed and hidden behind formal equality, formal equal political rights, even though there is a whole legal arsenal and the mechanisms of the bourgeois state are ready to put aside any right if bourgeois power is threatened. In reality, the bourgeois class's power to impose its will, to form its own institutions and mechanisms that serve its interests, originates from its economic power, the capitalist ownership of the means of production. The whole superstructure, the institutions and the mechanisms exist to defend and assist the reproduction of its domination. Therefore, with the term dictatorship of proletariat, Marxism scientifically refers to the political domination of the working class. The conquest of political power by the working class is also a precondition for its economic domination, for the overthrow of capitalist relations and the socialization of the means of production. The liberation of the working class from the dictatorship of the capital, from the yoke of the monopolies, and its emergence as a dominant class also liberates the rest of the working people. The state, we know that, did not always exist. The state is a product of unresolved class contradictions that are present in the society. The state appears during the evolution of history in places when the class contradictions objectively could not be compromised, and vice versa. The very existence of the state demonstrates that class contradictions cannot be resolved. In the primitive communal societies, there was no need for a state because classes did not exist. The state was born along with the class society thousands of years ago. This happened when the surplus product was created thanks to the development of the productive forces, meaning one part of the produced product from, for example, working the land, livestock, etc., which was not used for the satisfaction of immediate needs of the community. The appearance of the surplus product led over the course of time to its private appropriation and therefore led to the formation of private ownership over the means of production. In other words, class contradictions were born. The complete development of these contradictions created the exploitative distinction of society between the slaves and the slave owners. The first state in history that was formed was the state of the slave owners in order to impose their power on the slave class, on the slaves. Thereafter, during the evolution of society, the exploitative relations change according to the evolution of the productive forces. The distinction between slaves and slave owners was replaced by the serfs and the feudalists, and today by the workers and the capitalists. In each corresponding period, the state evolved and strengthened to serve the specific exploitative relations. The state consists of many institutions for the systematic implementation of compulsion against the exploited. It creates permanent, specific mechanisms, and it organizes the violence of the dominant class, for example, the army or the police. Also, several functions existing, administrative, defensive for the protection of the community, etc., before the appearance of state, in the context of the primitive community, become detached and are exercised by special institutions. These transitions during the evolution of humanity were hard but necessary, since the relations of production must correspond to the development of the productive forces that have been achieved at a specific time. However, today the productive forces that mark huge progress and development suffocate in the context of exploitative relations. The abolition of the exploitation of man by man, a great social leap, will contribute to a situation where the productive forces will correspond to the relations of production. The creation of these social relations, along with the institutions that emerged from them, was necessary in the evolution of history, and to that extent today their abolition is equally necessary for the further evolution of the society. Therefore, speaking of the state, we must always have in mind that the main issue is the issue of the power of one class over the other. The working class, as a direct producer that does not have, however, ownership over the means of production, as the exploited class in capitalism, is placed in various ways under the coercion of the bourgeois class and its state. The bourgeois state, as a mechanism for the domination of the capitalists over the workers, is a mechanism of oppression, repression, and manipulation against the workers. Nevertheless, the bourgeois class does not only organize the brutal repression and the exclusive practice of violence by the state mechanisms, but it also exercises multifaceted oppression. It organizes state judicial institutions in order to implement the law, which has as its core the defense of private ownership. It creates laws, constitutions, it establishes courts of justice and institutions to enforce this law, which in fact is unjust for the working class. In modern capitalist societies, the state also organizes the state educational system. It builds schools and universities. For example, it organizes the consent of the exploited working class and organizes the health, the welfare system, guaranteeing the conditions for the reproduction of the working class. Namely, it guarantees a basic level of education, a basic satisfaction of health, etc., as well as the reproduction of dominant ideology in politics in order to obscure and hide class exploitation. Moreover, the bourgeois state intervenes in the economy by passing measures facilitating the reproduction of capital on an extensive scale. The duty of the proletariat is to overthrow the bourgeois state as a precondition for the construction of the new society. The bourgeois state cannot change its class nature and cannot be used in favor of the working class and the poor popular strata. The working class, the proletariat, must take advantage of any gains, democratic rights acquired as a result of the class struggle, but not by restricting its aims to the improvement and the democratization of a bourgeois state, but towards the direction of organizing the struggle in order to overthrow bourgeois power. The bourgeois state is a state of the capitalists in order to secure their own interests. In its place, the working class must build its own state, the dictatorship of the proletariat. And the overthrow of the bourgeois state, of the capitalist state, is not possible without violence, without the proletarian socialist revolution. Socialism, as the first, the immature phase of communism, is a society in which class contradictions still exist, while afterwards some class contradictions and differences, potential class differences, are still maintained. For example, differences including the potential of historical regression. Firstly, there are the remnants of the defeated bourgeois class, which will fight until the end in order to take back the power that they lost. In addition, several contradictions of differences remain, such as these between the people of the city and the countryside, between manual and intellectual labor, which have their origin in the entire history of exploitative societies. Moreover, there are contradictions originating from the possibility that some sectors of production are not socialized directly at once. These are differences resulting from the division of labor. The historical experience of the Soviet Union showed that sections of agricultural productions, etc., maintained commodity relations. Commodity relations are a source of class inequalities. In addition, the conscience corresponding to the new communist relations, for example, the communist conscience, the communist attitude towards labor, is not shaped in a cohesive and automatic way among all the sectors of the working class and the people. Namely, there are still elements of the past that struggle against the new society that has been born. Historical experience has highlighted that this kind of struggle continues for a very long time. Thus, in socialism, the working class is constituted as the dominant class by its state, the dictatorship of the proletariat. The working class opposes the dictatorship of the bourgeois class, regardless of the form that it takes, for example, the parliamentary system, or fascism, or military dictatorship, etc., with its own dictatorship. As we said, the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is the democracy of workers who are dominant since they overthrew the power of the bourgeoisie. They took the means of production in their hands and are leading the construction of the new society, expressing also the interests of the other exploited strata by liberating them. Consequently, the dictatorship of the proletariat constitutes a means of continuing the class struggle with other means and forms under the conditions of the socialist construction. The necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat, of the socialist state, arises from the basic revolutionary duty of the workers' power, namely the formation of the new communist relations. A difficult task, since the passage to communism is not just a passage from one society to another. It is not a replacement of one exploitative class by another, but the definite and complete abolition of any form of private and group ownership over the means and results of production of every exploitative class and every social inequality. This necessity also arises from the continuation of the class struggle internationally, since the simultaneous passage of socialism at global level in every country at the same time is impossible. Only the vanguard social force, the working class, which is the vehicle of the communist relations, can accomplish this task with the leading role of its party, the Communist Party. The leap that takes place during the socialist construction is qualitatively higher than any previous one, since communist relations, as non-exploitative, cannot be formed in capitalism. The political revolution is the precondition for these new relations to be imposed and dominate. The conquest of power by the working class and the establishment of its own state, the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is a basic difference in the transition to the communist socio-economic formation in relation with the previous one. In the framework of the transition from an exploitative socio-economic formation to another, the new relations could be developed and dominate first in the confines of the previous socio-economic formation, and then, as the last part of this process, the class that was the bearer of the new relations struggled for and took power. This happened, for example, in relation to capitalism. Capitalist relations were first developed and dominated within the confines of feudalism, which brought about an unavoidable conflict between the rising bourgeois class and the class of the feudal nobility that was declining. The great bourgeois revolutions completed the absolute domination of the bourgeoisie through the seizure of political power, which of course was necessary in order for the capitalist relations to dominate everywhere and become fully developed. But communist relations are non-exploitative relations. Only their preconditions are developed within capitalism. Their appearance and domination requires the abolition of capitalist ownership of the means of production, which can only be done after having overthrown capitalist power and its state. Thus, the dictatorship of the proletariat has a double duty. On the one hand, to suppress and overcome the efforts of capitalists to retake the power, on the other, to form and develop the new relations, a task that is long-term and includes the whole period of the socialist construction, which is the period of the social revolution. The task of the revolutionary workers' power is to deepen and expand the communist relations in production and distribution, to form the new communist consciousness, the new man. This task is complex and long-term and includes economic, political, cultural, educational activity of the dictatorship of the proletariat under the guidance of the Communist Party. Revolutionary workers' power, the dictatorship of the proletariat, expresses a higher form of democracy, having as a basic feature the active participation of the working class in the construction of the socialist society. Democratic centralism is a fundamental principle in the formation and functioning of the socialist state, the direction of the production unit, every social service. That is, the united will and action of society in the direction of socialist construction, the active participation in making and implementing decisions, the subordination of the will of the minority to the will of the majority, the ability to elect and recall the organs of power. Revolutionary workers' power will be based on institutions that will be born from the revolutionary struggle of the working class and its allies. The bourgeois institutions will be replaced after being overturned by the new institutions of workers' power. The representatives in the organs of power will be elected and recalled, if necessary, by the assemblies of the workers in the production unit. Decisions will be made, control will be exercised. The representatives for the intermediate institutions will be elected and recalled directly. There will be indirect representation through the assemblies of the representatives of the highest organs of power. For example, the representatives to the intermediate organs will elect the representatives to the highest organs of power. The representatives will not have privileges, they will have responsibilities, and they will be accountable to those below. The organs of power that are elected by the workers in the production units have as their tasks the specialization of the central planning, the implementation of the tasks of social production, the social services, the cultural development, the protection of the revolution. There, at the level of the production unit, the participation of the working class is established and ensured from the bottom to the top, as is the exercise of workers' control, the criticism of decisions and increase, complaints about arbitrary and subjective attitudes, bureaucratic attitudes, weaknesses and deficiencies that can appear during the socialist period. The workers' collectives are accountable and monitored in order to promote the collective decisions of the higher organs of the workers' power, which have the overall responsibility of guidance, specifying the goals of each project that is decided on in the context of central planning. The effectiveness of, or otherwise, of each project is associated with the ability to understand the scientific laws in order to produce for the expanded satisfaction of social needs. The effectiveness of the project is tested in life itself, by practical experience itself. It's confirmed by the participation of the working masses in the control and the management of power. Workers' participation in the control and management of the power is guaranteed by the reduction of working time, which enables the development of the cultural and educational level of the workers. Besides, the dictatorship of the proletariat means just that. The state of the workers is based on the organization of the working masses and their participation in the management, the organization of the production and all services, the control of the administrative machinery, planning, and of course its implementation. With special provisions in the participation in the organs of power for sections of the population who are not in the process of the production will also be ensured. For example, young men and women who are still out of production because they are in the educational process will take part in the election of representatives through the educational units. In a similar manner, the participation of the non-working women, the pensioners, will be guaranteed. The highest organ of workers' power is an organ of workers. It legislates and administers at the same time. Within its framework, there is a division between legislative, executive, supervisory and disciplinary powers. It is not a parliament with the form of bourgeois parliamentary democracy that we know. The representatives that participate are not permanent but subject to recall. They don't have financial or other benefits. They are not cut off from production, from their work, but they are detached for the duration of their term. On the basis of the new relations of production, social ownership, central planning, workers' control, a new revolutionary constitution and legislation is formed in order to correspond to these new social relations and to defend them. Similarly, the entire legal system, all the legal establishment of the new social relations is also formed. A new judicial system is established, which is based on revolutionary popular institutions of justice. The new courts are under the direct responsibility of the organs of the workers' power. They consist of people's judges that will be elected and recalled by the people itself, and by a permanent judicial staff that will be accountable to the institutions of workers' power. The revolutionary workers' power replaces all the old mechanisms of administration that receives with new ones, corresponding to the character of the proletarian state. The new organs of revolutionary protection and defense are based on the workers' and people's participation, but also on permanent professional personnel. In place of the bourgeois army and the repressive forces, new institutions are created on the basis of the armed revolutionary struggle in order to crush the resistance of the exploiters and to defend the revolution and socialist construction. Now it would be quite interesting to see how the dictatorship of the proletariat was formed in through the historical experience of the first warrior state in the world, the Soviet Union. The new state power that emerged from the great socialist October Revolution had to face a lot of problems and complex conditions. The working class was a minority within the population of farmers that were in a state of political and cultural backwardness. It was from the very first moment encircled by the counter-revolutionary activity and imperialist attack. A huge part of the vanguard of the working class was lost because of the imperialist intervention and the civil war. Initially, it had to utilize sections of the old bureaucracy and bourgeois specialists in sectors of the economy, production and administration, while the kulaks, which was the bourgeoisie in the villages, maintained great power in the countryside. They even had the control of the rural Soviets. The establishment and stabilization of Soviet power was not an easy or quick task. The new power was based on the institutions that were born from each revolutionary struggle. The institutions of socialist power were the Soviets, the councils of the workers' representatives, the representatives of military, and afterwards the farmers' Soviets, hence the name Soviet Union. The new state that was constructed was the revolutionary workers' power, what we call the dictatorship of the proletariat. Based on the social ownership of the concentrated means of production and on the cooperative of peasants from the 1930s onwards, it expressed the interests of the majority of the exploited that overthrew the power of the minority of the exploiters. The dictatorship of the proletariat proved to be a superior, a higher form of democracy, since workers' power led the working masses into participation, control and administration of the power and of the social life in general. It drew the masses from the sidelines. Through the organization of power in the production unit, the working class was able to develop organization and discipline. Through participation in the control and administration of the production unit, there had been steps in order to change the consciousness, in order to put the social interests above the individual. Apart from the institutions of the workers' power, the Soviets, a vast number of mass organizations were also developed. Trade unions, cultural, educational, women's, youth, where the majority of the population was organized and participated. The direct participation of workers took place until 1936 through the core of the workers' power at the factory, the production unit, the village, but also through the function of a series of mass organizations. During the procedures for the approval of significant state laws, for example the constitutional amendments, assemblies of the workers' power were held where the workers expressed their opinion and, through voting, their position on the matter. The direct participation of workers was accompanied by the indirect election in the representative bodies, as was established in the first constitution of the Soviet Union in 1924. The representatives were accountable and the collective unit had the right to recall them and elect others in their position. The indirect electoral representation ensured the will and participation of workers in the institutions of the Soviet power. In that way, the will of the majority was established. The Soviets were not only responsible for the decision-making, but also for their application. During the assemblies, the cell of the workers' power discussed the central and particular plans of the branches, the decisions that they made. They implemented them as working organs with delegates that were not cut off from production. In the Constitution of 1936, direct electoral representation was established through geographical electoral wards and not through the production unit. After the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1956, and under the weight of more general weaknesses, a deviation, a retreat in the party's perception was expressed regarding the class-oriented revolutionary character of the state and the rejection of the scientific law for the continuation of the class struggle during socialist construction. Nevertheless, in the Soviet Union, the institutions functioning expressed an unprecedented participation of the masses in political action. According to statistical data of 1977, the local organs of state power, for example the Soviets of Representatives, were more than 50,000 all over the country. In these Soviets, there were more than 2,200,000 elected representatives, namely around 1% of the Soviet Union total population. It is also estimated that within 41 years from the Constitution of 1936, more than 25 million people participated in the Soviets. In addition, it is estimated that in the organs of people's control, at the production units, the services and the kolkhozes, the production cooperatives, were elected every 2 years at the workers' assemblies, and that about 9 million workers participated in these organs. Comparing to this, the bourgeois parliamentary democracy seems like a joke. In the Soviet Constitution, despite any criticism that may be made, the nature of the organs was safeguarded. For example, even in the Constitution, the Soviet Constitution of 1977, Article 104 described the non-professional nature for the elected delegates and their exclusion from privileges. It was writing, "Deputies shall exercise their powers without discontinuing their regular employment or duties." In addition, Article 107 specified the obligation of the deputies to report on their work and the possibility to be recalled. The article was writing, "Deputies shall report on their work and on that of the Soviet to their constituents, and to the work collectives and public organizations that nominated them. Deputies who have not justified the confidence of their constituents may be recalled at any time by decision of a majority of the electors in accordance with the procedure established by law." However, in that process there were obviously some weaknesses. The procedure of the socialist construction constantly creates new problems that seek new solutions, and this is when the ability of the workers' powers is judged. First of all, what is judged is the ability of the Communist Party to lead in accordance with the scientific laws. In the Soviet Union, the legacy of the old social system weighed heavy as the new one emerged from its bowels. For example, from the first years of the social construction, problems of detachment from the interests of the working class arose within the employees of the state mechanism, and especially by those who came from the old Tsarist state mechanism. The adoption of the thesis concerning the state of the whole people, which was consolidated in the constitutional revision of 1977, cancelled out the nature of the dictatorship of the proletariat as the workers' power, rejected the vanguard role of the working class as the bearer of communist relations. The sharpening of the problems in Soviet power was a consequence of the weakening of the socialist economy through the adoption of market reforms, which led to the reinforcement of the individual and group interests vis-à-vis the overall interests of society. As a result, the forces that had an interest in the overthrow of socialism and the restoration of capitalism gained strength. This development influenced the structures of power and the workers' control, which had attained a formal character. In the decade of the 1980s, through perestroika, which was a final attack by the counter-revolution, the Soviet system degenerated into a bourgeois parliamentary organ with a division of the executive and legislative function. Everything negative that was developed back then was an element of the forms of the bourgeois power. Summarizing all the above, we conclude by saying the following. The social revolution cannot be restricted only to the conquest of power and the formation of the economic base for socialist development, but is extended during the entire socialist course. It includes the development of socialism for the attainment of the higher communist phase. During this long-term transition from the capitalist to the developed communist society, the policies of revolutionary workers' power, with the Communist Party as the leading force, prioritize the formation, extension and deepening of the new social relations, their full and irreversible prevalence, not in a subjective manner, but based on the loss of the communist mode of production. It is thus that the class struggle of the working class continues, under new conditions with other forms and means, not only during the period when the foundations of socialism are being laid, but also during the development of socialism. It is an ongoing battle for the abolition of every form of group and individual ownership over the means and products of production, and of the petit bourgeois consciousness that has deep historical roots. It is a struggle for the formation of an analogous social consciousness and attitude corresponding to the directly social character of labor. Consequently, the dictatorship of the proletariat as an instrument of class domination and class struggle is absolutely necessary, not only during the transition period, for the consolidation of the new power, the realization of the measures for the development of the new economic relations and the abolition of the capitalist relations, but also during the development of socialism until its maturation into the higher communist stage.